Let me ask you something right now. Have you ever tried everything just to be seen? You gave your presence, your energy, your attention, your consistency. You showed up even when it hurt. You texted first. You stayed late. You carried the emotional weight. But despite all that, they still pulled away. And in the silence that followed, something strange happened. You didn't scream. You didn't beg. You simply stepped back, calmly. And suddenly, they began to feel the very thing they once ignored, you. Why does that happen? Why does your silence echo louder than your words ever could? Why do they seem to notice your worth the moment you stop trying to prove it? My friend, we've been sold a lie. A lie that love equals effort, that presence equals value, that chasing someone who's distant is how you show you care. But what if I told you that's not strength, that's fear? And what if I told you there's another way, one rooted not in noise but in power? Not in reaction, but in stillness? Let's confront the truth together. Everything you've been taught about what makes someone stay might be backward. And today, I'm inviting you to flip that script, to embrace a form of emotional mastery that doesn't shout, doesn't chase, but pulls with gravity. A way of being that makes their heart lean in, not because you demanded it, but because your calm created the space for truth to speak. This isn't about games. It's about transformation. About stepping into a higher version of yourself that doesn't need validation to know your worth. We're talking about stoicism in the real world, how emotional control, inner peace, and quiet confidence reshape not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. This isn't theory. This is practice. Real, grounded, powerful practice. And by the time we're done, you'll understand why your silence isn't just absence, it's presence at its most potent. So if you've ever asked, do they even care? Stick with me. Because what comes next might just shift the way you understand connection, love, and yourself. This is the moment clarity begins. This is Stoic Relationships in motion. Ready? 1. The power of calm detachment. There's something unsettling about a person who doesn't react the way others expect. When you step back calmly, without anger, without blame, without dramatic exits, the silence left behind doesn't create distance, it creates reflection. In a world conditioned to associate love with noise, urgency, and emotional labor, calm detachment becomes the loudest presence in the room. They expect you to plead, to text just one more time, to ask, "Are we okay?" Because that's the cycle we've all been trained to repeat. But when you don't, when you step back not as a performance but as a decision, something begins to stir in them. Suddenly, the pattern breaks. The rhythm they relied on disappears. And in that stillness, their thoughts begin to race. The truth is, most people are not used to others choosing peace over panic. They confuse stillness with indifference. They mistake calm with coldness. But there's a difference, and deep down they feel it. Because when your detachment is rooted in clarity, not cruelty, it doesn't push people away. It pulls their attention in. It makes them reconsider. It forces them to examine what they never thought they'd lose. Have you ever walked away without saying goodbye, not because you didn't care, but because you'd said everything without words already? That's the power we're talking about. That's where stoicism lives, not in ignoring emotions, but in mastering them so deeply that you no longer let external chaos dictate your internal peace. And the beauty of calm detachment is that it doesn't chase, it attracts. It doesn't force understanding, it invites introspection. Your absence isn't a punishment. It's a mirror. And what they see in that mirror, that's what makes their heart follow. Because now there's no one left to project on, no more emotional cushions to fall back on, no more predictable reactions to rely on. You've removed the performance and left only presence. They feel the shift. Not because you shouted, but because you stopped. They start to question their own behavior, not out of guilt, but out of realization. They begin to trace the outlines of your energy and notice the places where it no longer lives. And that, my friend, is when gravity begins. The kind of gravity that doesn't scream but draws them closer because you're no longer trying to prove anything. You're just standing in your truth. You're not moving out of spite, but out of self-respect. That's what Stoic relationships are built on, not desperation, but discernment. And when they finally realize you didn't walk away in rage but in resolve, the story starts to change. They revisit every moment you stayed silent. They replay the conversations where you chose grace over reaction. They remember the steadiness you gave freely and begin to understand its value, only now that it's gone. The stoicism in your detachment becomes a message they can't ignore. Because when everything goes quiet, every little thing you did starts to echo louder. They thought love was a chase. They thought effort had to be loud. But now they're faced with a stillness that says, "I'm done proving." And that stillness speaks volumes. It's not that you don't care, it's that you care enough about yourself to no longer participate in something unreciprocated. That alone shifts the energy of any relationship. People notice when the one who always cared goes quiet. They may not admit it, but they feel it. They feel it when you stop reaching out. When your texts stop lighting up their phone. When your emotional labor is no longer cushioning their indecision. And for the first time, they have to sit with themselves. The detachment you chose isn't about withdrawal. It's about redirection, pulling your energy inward so you can heal, reflect, and realign. You stop reacting, not because you're defeated, but because you've awakened. You've seen the cycle for what it is and decided to step out of it, not as a punishment to them, but as a gift to yourself. That kind of clarity is rare. That kind of power is disruptive. And people notice. Even if they don't say it, even if their ego keeps them silent, even if their pride keeps them distant, they notice. Because you've become the calm they never appreciated until it vanished. You've become the quiet they can't tune out. That's the power of Stoicism. That's what Stoic relationships offer, not emotional silence, but emotional sovereignty. When you stop giving just to be noticed, when you stop speaking just to be understood, you begin to radiate something far stronger than words, presence. And presence, when detached from need, becomes magnetic. It's no longer about making someone see your worth. It's about standing in it so firmly that they can't look away. And yes, there's discomfort in that. There's loneliness in detachment. But that loneliness is sacred. It teaches you to stop filling silence with noise. It shows you how to sit in your own energy and feel whole. And when you do that, something fascinating happens. The people who never saw your value when you were close begin to crave your nearness. Not because you manipulated them, but because you finally saw yourself clearly. They start to feel the absence of your emotional availability and wonder where it went. But here's the truth, it didn't disappear. You reclaimed it. You stopped pouring into a space that was never designed to hold your depth. And that realization? It creates a ripple they can't escape. So when their heart begins to follow, when they start to circle back, when the silence becomes too heavy to bear, remember, it wasn't because you played a game. It was because you stopped playing altogether. You stepped out of the performance and into your peace. And peace, especially when delivered calmly, disrupts the patterns of chaos more powerfully than any explosion ever could. That's what makes them notice. That's what makes them feel. Because you didn't fight harder, you let go smarter. You didn't raise your voice, you deepened your presence. And now their heart follows not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Out of respect. Out of a quiet understanding that what you offered was rare, and now, it's no longer available on demand. That's what makes calm detachment unforgettable. That's what makes it transformational. In Stoic relationships, you don't beg to be chosen. You become so rooted in your own clarity that others must choose to rise to meet you, or let you walk away. And whichever path they take, you still win. Because you've chosen something deeper than connection, you've chosen alignment. You've honored your peace. And when peace is your priority, detachment becomes your strength. That's the beginning of true power. That's the beginning of emotional gravity. And that's why, when you step back calmly, their heart begins to follow, not because you made them, but because your absence revealed everything your presence once gave so freely. And now, in the silence, they finally understand its weight. 2. Silence creates emotional space. Have you ever noticed how loud silence can be when someone you once relied on simply stops speaking? It's disorienting, even haunting. That's because silence isn't just the absence of words, it's the presence of emotional space. And emotional space is where all the noise you used to ignore comes to the surface. See, when you've always been the one to bridge the gap, to soften the edges, to speak first, your voice becomes the glue that holds together not just the bond, but the illusion of stability. But what happens when you stop? When you choose to let silence stretch out long enough for truth to rise? That's when reality gets uncomfortable, and that discomfort isn't a mistake, it's the point. Because in Stoic relationships, silence is not passive. It's powerful. It's active. It's intentional. It's the place where boundaries become visible, where feelings become undeniable, and where unspoken truths begin to echo louder than any conversation ever could. And if you're the one who's always held the emotional line, always initiating, always explaining, always soothing, then stepping back into silence might feel unnatural at first. It might feel harsh. But that's only because you've been conditioned to believe that your value is tied to your effort, your emotional output, your consistency. It's not. Your value doesn't disappear when your voice does. In fact, for the first time, it might actually be seen for what it really is. Because emotional space doesn't just create distance, it reveals the truth. Think about it. When you stop talking, they finally have to sit with their own thoughts. When you stop reaching out, they're left with the weight of what they never had to carry before. When you stop smoothing over the silence with reassurance, they finally hear the tension they refuse to acknowledge. That's what your silence gives them, not punishment, but reflection. It's not about control. It's about clarity. And clarity often arrives when everything else stops. This is the quiet realm of Stoicism, where peace doesn't come from controlling others, it comes from releasing them. And releasing the need to be heard is how you finally begin to hear yourself. Silence creates space not just for them, but for you. For your own healing. For your own reckoning. For your own truth. And that's what they begin to notice, not your voice, but your absence. Not your presence, but the weight of your energy no longer being poured into the connection. It hits differently when someone who used to give so much chooses to go quiet. It forces them to ask, "Did I lose something real?" And not because you told them, but because the space left behind says it more honestly than words ever could. That's the beauty of emotional space, it cannot be faked, forced, or ignored. It has a way of holding up a mirror to everything we pretend not to see. And in that mirror, they don't just see you, they see themselves. They see the imbalance. They see the dependency. They see the ways they relied on your emotional labor as a buffer against their own growth. And when you take that away, it doesn't just shift the relationship, it shifts the entire dynamic. You go from being the one they assumed would always be there to the one they now wonder if they'll ever get back. That shift, that realization, is where emotional gravity begins. They feel the pull not because you're drawing them in, but because their own soul is reacting to the space you've left behind. That's not manipulation. That's alignment. You've removed your energy with intention. You've stepped out of the emotional loop not to get a response, but to find your own peace. And in doing so, you've created a space so real, so undeniable, that it starts to expose everything they tried to keep hidden beneath your presence. That's when people start asking questions. Not to you, but to themselves. They wonder if they took you for granted. They replay the last conversation. They reread your old texts. They begin to realize how much of your presence they've been leaning on without ever truly appreciating it. And the silence you've chosen becomes the teacher they didn't know they needed. But here's the deeper truth. The silence isn't for them. It's for you. It's for the version of yourself that's tired of giving everything just to maintain something one-sided. It's for the you that's learning to be at peace without performance. That's where Stoicism becomes a compass. Not in becoming cold, but in becoming clear. You're not punishing them. You're protecting yourself. And in that space, you start to remember who you were before the need to be heard overtook your need to be whole. That's what emotional space does. It restores you. It detoxes your mind from overthinking, your heart from overextending, and your soul from overcompensating. And in the stillness, you begin to see the connection for what it is, not what you hoped it could be. That vision, that insight, becomes your new foundation. Because now you're not chasing connection, you're choosing alignment. You're not asking to be understood, you're understanding yourself. And in that shift, their curiosity grows. Their feelings awaken. Their memories stir. Not because you orchestrated it, but because you finally stopped orchestrating anything at all. That's when your silence becomes sacred. It becomes more than a moment, it becomes a movement, a redirection of energy, a reclamation of self. And it sends a message louder than any words could. I will not shrink myself to be understood by someone who never listened when I was loudest. That's the moment your absence starts to echo. Not out of cruelty, but out of calm. Not out of resentment, but out of realization. And they feel it. Even if they don't admit it. Even if they don't react. Even if they pretend nothing's changed. They feel it. Because energy doesn't lie. And when your energy leaves a space it once filled, that emptiness speaks volumes. That's when they start asking themselves, did I miss something irreplaceable? And you won't be there to answer. Because this space isn't a tactic, it's a truth. One that only reveals itself in your stillness. So if you've ever felt like your voice was being wasted, your efforts unnoticed, your presence unappreciated, try stepping back. Not with bitterness, but with bravery. Let the silence speak. Let it create the emotional space where real awareness begins. Because that's where their heart will begin to move, not when you speak louder, but when you stop speaking altogether. If this message speaks to you, like and comment. Number 1, if you feel the shift. And if you're ready to explore more truths like this, deep, real, and life-changing, subscribe now. There's more to this path. Let's walk it together. 3. Absence awakens curiosity. There's a moment after you've stepped back when everything becomes still, not just in your life, but in theirs. It's that exact stillness that begins to stir something they didn't expect. Not guilt. Not regret. Not even longing, not yet. It begins with curiosity. A subtle shift in the mind, a quiet voice that whispers, "Where did they go?" And it doesn't ask out of loss, it asks out of confusion. Because until now, they've been used to your energy, used to your warmth, your check-ins, your emotional presence. They never had to earn it. They never had to question it. You were always there. Consistent. Reliable. Present. That's the baseline they built their expectations on. So when you stop, not with vengeance, not with an announcement, but simply and calmly, it disrupts something. They feel it. But they don't know what to do with it. That's where curiosity begins. You see, the human mind is wired for patterns. It finds comfort in what's predictable, even if it never fully appreciated it. And when you, the emotionally consistent one, break that pattern, it sets off alarms in their subconscious. Not the kind that scream, just the kind that ask questions. Why didn't they text today? Did I do something wrong? Are they okay? Are they angry? That confusion quickly turns inward. And from there, the emotional curiosity begins to build. But here's the thing, it doesn't start from the heart. It starts from the disruption of expectation. And that disruption is powerful because it calls attention to something they've always had but never questioned, your emotional labor. When that labor stops, not only do they begin to notice, but they begin to remember. That's the strange paradox of presence. People don't feel it when it's there, they feel it when it's gone. And you, perhaps without even knowing it. Created a rhythm in their life they relied on. Not because they asked you to, but because you offered it. Freely. Repeatedly. Lovingly. And now your absence makes that rhythm stop. Suddenly. There's no message waiting. No thoughtful check-in. No silent support flowing in the background of their day. And that absence becomes a question mark they can't resolve. They may pretend not to notice. They may even double down on their distance. But their thoughts are not silent. They are curious. They are wandering back through the past, looking for a sign of when you began to slip away. They are revisiting the conversations they once brushed off. They are replaying your laughter, your concern, your care. Because now it's not there. And the mind, when left without closure, begins to fill in the blanks. That's the unseen power of absence. It activates a deeper awareness in them than any emotional outburst ever could. And yet, you're not playing games. You're not doing this to manipulate them. You're not trying to be mysterious. You're simply no longer offering yourself to someone who never made room for your value. That's not a tactic. That's growth. That's stoicism. And it's the kind of clarity that causes shifts, not just in you, but in them. Because your calm exit forces a confrontation with themselves. Not with what they lost, but with what they ignored. And in that confrontation, curiosity becomes a quiet teacher. It makes them see what they refuse to acknowledge. It brings their own emotional laziness into focus. It reminds them that presence isn't infinite. That energy, when not reciprocated, eventually returns home. They begin to watch from afar. They check your social media. They reread your messages. They look for signs. They look for answers. Not because they're ready to change, but because they can no longer pretend your absence doesn't mean something. They don't come out and say it. They may never tell anyone. But that curiosity lives in their behavior. In the sudden views on your story. In the mutual friends they ask about you. In the subtle breadcrumbs they leave, hoping you'll re-engage. But you won't. Because now, you've learned to let curiosity do its work. You've learned that when you constantly explain yourself, you rob others of the chance to reflect. You've learned that when you always speak, no one listens. But when you go quiet, that's when they finally hear. And not just hear you, but hear themselves. That's what Stoic relationships require. The discipline to remain still while they unravel in the space you once held. You're no longer chasing clarity. You're watching it unfold. And yes, it's tempting to break the silence, to clarify, to reconnect. But you won't. Because you understand the deeper rhythm at play. You've created a vacuum, not to punish, but to expose. And in that vacuum, they begin to see the weight of your energy. They start to feel the emotional cost of your absence. Not the surface-level void of a missing text, but the deeper hollowness of no longer being cared for in a way they took for granted. And that hollowness breeds curiosity. It compels them to ask questions they never thought they'd ask. Did I ever really see them clearly? Did I appreciate what they gave? Was I even present in return? These are not easy questions. But they are necessary. And they don't arrive in noise. They arrive in silence. That's where real emotional revelation happens, not in confrontation, but in contemplation. And that's what you've given them by stepping away. You've invited curiosity not through strategy, but through stillness. You've stopped offering answers and, in doing so, created the space for them to start asking the right questions. That's what shifts the energy. That's what makes your absence feel like presence. That's what transforms distance into reflection. And as much as they might resist it, the truth begins to seep in. You were never trying to be mysterious. You were never trying to create tension. You were simply trying to be understood. And when that didn't happen, you stopped forcing it. That alone changes the game. Because now, they're left to wonder about something real, not what they imagined you to be, but who you really were when you were fully present. That mystery isn't born out of games. It's born out of emotional imbalance finally being corrected. And it teaches both of you. It teaches them about the consequences of neglect. And it teaches you about the strength of self-respect. That's how Stoicism works, not as a mask for pain, but as a structure for power. Your curiosity is no longer outward, it's inward. You're no longer asking, "Why don't they see me?" Instead, you're asking, "Why did I stay unseen for so long?" And that shift redirects your path. You're no longer orbiting around someone's potential. You're walking your own. And if they feel that shift, if their heart starts to stir, if their curiosity begins to ache, it's not your responsibility to fix it. You've already done your part. You've loved. You've shown up. You've given. And now you've let go. What they do with that silence is theirs to own. And what you do with your space is yours to honor. That is emotional maturity. That is self-leadership. That is the heart of Stoic relationships, learning when to speak, and more importantly, when to stop. Because sometimes, the most powerful connection isn't made through conversation. It's made through absence. The kind that doesn't beg to be felt. It just is. And when it is, curiosity does the rest. 4. The mind craves closure. There's a part of the human psyche that just can't let go of an unfinished story. It clings, replays, reimagines, and obsesses, especially when something ends without a clear reason. That part is your mind's desperate craving for closure. It's not a flaw, it's a design feature. The brain wants to complete narratives. It wants to file emotions into neat folders and explain every exit with a label that feels final. But when someone walks away calmly, silently, without dramatics, without anger, and most powerfully, without explanation, what's left behind is not peace for the other person, it's chaos. Not external chaos. Internal. Because now, the mind has to fill in the silence. It starts searching through memories, digging through details, scanning old texts, and replaying every single word you said in the final weeks before you stepped away. It becomes desperate for something that makes sense. And that desperation is where your silence becomes the loudest thing in their life. Think about it. When someone leaves after a massive fight or a dramatic goodbye, the story feels finished, even if it hurts. Even if the pain lingers. The mind at least has something to grip. But when you leave without burning the bridge, when you stop reaching out without an announcement, when you become unavailable with grace instead of rage, it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a question. A question that won't go away. A question that haunts their idle moments, fills the gaps between their distractions, and becomes the new soundtrack to their sleepless nights. That's what Stoicism looks like in real time, not silence for revenge, but silence for peace. Not absence as punishment, but as self-preservation. But they don't understand that yet. All they feel is the void. The quiet. The unknown. And in that unknown, the mind becomes its own worst enemy. It starts inventing reasons. It creates theories. It tries to protect itself by finding closure where none was offered. And here's where the emotional spiral begins, not because you're trying to cause confusion, but because your stillness created an emotional vacuum. And that vacuum is now pulling in every fear, every regret, every moment they dismissed when you were still speaking. They feel this vacuum not just in their thoughts, but in their nervous system. Because emotionally, the human body reacts to unfinished connection as a threat. That's why the silence eats at them. Not because they miss control, but because their mind doesn't know how to end the story. And when you step away with calm, when you don't give the final explanation, when you don't argue, when you don't text one last time just to be heard, they feel like they're flipping through a book that's missing the last chapter. And no matter how hard they try to rewrite the ending in their head, it never satisfies. Because only the author can write the truth. But you're no longer writing that story. You've closed your chapter quietly, respectfully, powerfully. And now they're stuck in emotional limbo. They can't hate you because you didn't do anything cruel. They can't blame you because your exit was calm. They can't even call you immature. Because your silence wasn't petty, it was sacred. And that sacred silence becomes the mirror they can't look away from. It reflects everything they refused to see when you were still speaking. It shows them who they were in the connection. It forces them to feel the weight of what they didn't give, and more importantly, what you were giving all along. But here's the thing, they won't tell you this. They may not even admit it to themselves. Instead, they'll distract. They'll post. They'll laugh loudly in places where they hope you'll hear. But inside, the silence is doing its work. It's working through their defenses. It's making them face the raw, unfiltered truth that your presence meant more than they admitted. That your consistency was a gift they never earned. That your calm exit was a declaration of self-worth, not a cry for attention. And that's what eats at them, not the fact that you left, but the way you did it. The way you left them with no pieces to glue back together. No narrative to hold on to. No villain to blame. Because how do you argue with peace? How do you fight with someone who stopped playing the game? You can't. That's the brilliance of Stoic relationships. You don't burn the bridge. You simply walk off it and let time decide who dares to follow. And in the meantime, they sit in silence. Not yours, but their own. A silence that becomes louder with each passing day. A silence that forces them to face their own emotional immaturity, their emotional laziness, their assumptions. It becomes a slow unraveling, not of the connection, but of their version of it. Because now they see it for what it truly was. And if they were never meant to stay, that truth becomes clear. But if they were, your silence plants a seed. A seed of responsibility. A seed of introspection. And from there, transformation either happens, or it doesn't. Either way, you've done your part. You've stepped back not to be chased, but to be centered. You've stopped talking not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. You've honored your own peace more than their potential. That's the essence of Stoicism and love. It's not passive. It's powerful. It's the quiet strength to walk away without proving anything. And that strength speaks louder than any last word ever could. So when they start to feel the weight of your silence, when they begin to spiral through old memories, when they start constructing 1,000 false endings to a story you already closed, know this, your absence is working. Not for revenge, but for revelation. You didn't leave to cause pain. You left to stop causing yourself pain. And now they're learning what it feels like to sit in that space. To feel what was always there. Hidden beneath the noise. And yes, they'll try to silence it again. They'll busy themselves. They'll chase new connections. But nothing quite feels the same. Because what's missing now isn't just your attention, it's your energy. It's the calm you brought. The presence you carried. The steadiness you offered. And no one else quite replicates that. Because you weren't just someone, they're now realizing, you were someone rare. And that realization stings. Not because you rubbed it in their face, but because you didn't. That's what makes it linger. That's what makes it unforgettable. That's what makes your silence remembered. So if you're wondering whether they're thinking about you, wondering whether your absence matters, the answer is yes. Not because they'll say it, but because their mind can't close the loop. And until it does, you'll live in the space between their thoughts. You'll echo in the places where they once felt secure. Not because you left with noise, but because you left with grace. And in the world of Stoic relationships, grace is the final chapter. A chapter that needs no words. If that hit you deep, like and comment. Number 1. If this video gave you clarity. And if you want more truth spoken with strength, hit that subscribe button now. The next part is where we turn that silence into the ultimate mirror. 5. Stillness shatters ego, not connection. There's something profoundly misunderstood about silence, especially in the context of emotional relationships. People often mistake it for absence, or worse, for punishment. But real stillness, the kind that emerges from clarity and not conflict, isn't about breaking love, it's about breaking the illusion. And the illusion, my friend, is ego. That subtle, silent belief someone carries when they assume they can always come and go from your life without consequence. That quiet entitlement that grows when they're used to your constant emotional presence, your quick replies, your predictable understanding, your readiness to clarify and clean up every uncomfortable moment. When you remove that pattern not in anger but in peace, you don't destroy the connection, you destroy the grip their ego had over it. You don't end the bond, you end their control over how it operates. You stop showing up in the ways they've grown used to, and suddenly, their sense of emotional superiority begins to unravel. Not because you attacked them, not because you lashed out, but because you didn't. You chose not to argue. You chose not to respond. You chose not to play. And in that choosing, you rewrote the rules of engagement. Think about how many times you've been drawn into a cycle where your value was measured by how much you were willing to explain yourself, where your worth was tethered to how quickly you responded to emotional inconsistency, where your peace was regularly interrupted just to keep a connection alive. That's not connection. That's performance. And when you go still, when you refuse to keep performing, the ego of the other person has no choice but to face itself. Because it no longer gets to play director of the narrative. It no longer gets to say when and how you show up. You've taken that power back, and not through aggression, but through non-participation. That's the part most people don't understand. They think strength comes from confrontation. But in Stoic relationships, the deepest form of power is not in the reaction, it's in the refusal to react. It's the inner stillness that doesn't need to be proven, justified, or defended. And when you embody that, you become a mirror, one that reflects back the emotional immaturity, the imbalance, the expectations they held without ever examining them. At first, they may interpret your silence as distance, as disinterest. But as time stretches, they begin to realize it's not detachment, it's evolution. You've stopped engaging with their ego, and now all they have left to deal with is themselves. No buffer. No emotional safety net. Just the raw truth that your consistency was never owed. That your patience wasn't a weakness. That your emotional availability was a gift, not a guarantee. And in the absence of your participation, the ego no longer gets to hide. That's when real introspection begins. That's when the connection, if it's true, begins to either deepen or dissolve. Because if love was real, it will find its way through the stillness. But if it was built on dependency, expectation, and unspoken manipulation, then your silence will reveal that. Stillness doesn't destroy the connection. It tests its foundation. And most people don't want to admit that. Because it's easier to label you distant than to admit they only knew how to relate to you when they were in control. It's easier to say you changed than to acknowledge you simply grew. It's easier to paint you as cold than to accept they've been emotionally coddled for so long that they mistook stability for submission. But the truth has a way of rising in stillness. Because silence is not the absence of communication, it's the beginning of revelation. When you stop giving them something to push against, they're forced to confront the reflection. Not the one you shaped for them, the one they shaped for themselves. That's where transformation happens, or where the connection fades. And either outcome is a win. Because now, you're living in alignment, not in performance. Now you're grounded in your value, not waiting for someone else to confirm it. That's the core of Stoicism. To be unshaken by outside events. To recognize that you can only control your response, and to release everything else. You don't owe anyone your reaction. You don't owe anyone your emotional labor. And once you understand that, your stillness becomes your strength. It becomes the barrier that protects your peace and the filter that exposes the truth. It doesn't scream. It doesn't slam doors. It simply stands firm. Rooted in clarity. And clarity is something the ego cannot manipulate. So don't be surprised when they start to reach out, not because they miss you, but because they miss the version of themselves they got to be when you were always available. Don't be fooled by the breadcrumbs, the vague messages, the sudden attention. Remember, Ego is loud when it loses its audience. But you're no longer in the audience. You've stepped onto your own path. And from this place of stillness, you can see clearly. You can see who comes back with humility and who returns with the same script. And now you have the space to choose. Not out of need, but out of discernment. Because you've become someone who no longer needs chaos to feel seen. You no longer need emotional turbulence to feel love. You've matured into someone who finds value in peace, in presence, in grounded connection. That's the transformation stillness brings. That's the truth ego can't stand. Because ego wants the last word. But you don't give it one. You simply move on. Quietly. Powerfully. Fully. That's why they remember you. That's why they feel you. Not because of what you said, but because of what you stopped saying. Not because you shouted, but because you didn't. You became the person who no longer feeds the emotional machine. You unplugged. You reclaimed your center. And now, they sit with the aftermath, not because you punished them, but because you protected yourself. That's the line they never thought you'd draw. That's the boundary they never thought you'd enforce. And now, here they are, face to face with their ego. And no longer with your reassurance. It's uncomfortable for them, but necessary. Because no one grows from being emotionally enabled. And no connection survives without being tested. Your stillness is that test. Your absence is that mirror. Your peace is the lesson. Whether they learn it or not is their journey. But yours? Yours is already unfolding. And it's built on something unshakable. It's built on strength that doesn't waver just because someone doesn't see it. It's built on truth that doesn't need applause to stand tall. It's built on the kind of power that doesn't respond, it reveals. And that's why your stillness is not the end of the connection. It's the end of your performance. The beginning of something real. The beginning of someone whole. You. 6. True connection is revealed in absence. There comes a point in every connection when the surface behaviors no longer sustain the bond, when the words, the gestures, the habitual interactions stop being enough to hide the truth underneath, and that's where absence becomes the ultimate test. Not absence out of spite or manipulation, but the kind of calm, intentional distance that strips away the distractions, the performative affection, the performative understanding, and lays bare what the relationship is truly built on. Because here's a stoic truth most people avoid confronting: real connection doesn't require constant performance. It doesn't demand presence at the cost of peace. And it certainly doesn't fear silence. In fact, true connection thrives in it. Because when the distractions fall away, when there's no more texting out of obligation, no more calling just to prevent silence from becoming uncomfortable, what's left is the pure energy between two souls. And energy, unlike words, cannot be faked. You feel it or you don't. You reciprocate it or you don't. That's why the moment you pull back with grace, everything begins to shift. The people who truly valued you, who saw you, who met you with equal depth, they won't fade. They'll feel the absence not as a threat, but as an invitation. They'll reach out, not out of panic, but out of presence. They'll come closer because they never relied on your noise to feel close. They relied on your essence. And those who vanish? Let them. Because what they felt was not you. It was what you gave them. And when that giving stopped, so did their interest. That's not your loss. That's your clarity. This is what Stoicism teaches us, not to be cold or withdrawn, but to understand the difference between attachment and alignment. You can be deeply connected to someone and still walk away if the energy is no longer mutual. You can love someone fully and still remove yourself from their life if they only love the version of you that keeps chasing. That's not cruelty. That's self-respect. That's the beginning of emotional adulthood. And when you begin living from that truth, the way people react to your absence tells you everything you need to know. Some will stay quiet, hoping you'll return to the old pattern. Others will get louder, trying to provoke you back into chasing. And then there are the rare few, the ones who step forward without fear, without ego, without games. They don't need your validation because they've already validated you with their consistent presence. Those are the ones who are truly connected to you. Everyone else? They were connected to your effort. And when your effort stopped, so did their involvement. That's how you know. That's how you separate the real from the convenient. That's how you stop carrying the weight of relationships that were never grounded in truth. Because here's the deeper reality. Most people don't even know they're in a one-sided relationship until they stop pouring. And when they do, when they choose stillness over scrambling, silence over explaining, that's when the true nature of the bond is revealed. That's when the unspoken contract breaks open and both people have to face what was actually holding them together. Was it love? Or was it habit? Was it connection? Or was it comfort? Was it truth? Or was it fear of being alone? These are the questions absence answers, slowly, quietly, and without apology. And the answers aren't always easy. Sometimes the people you thought would fight for you do nothing. Sometimes the ones you kept warm leave you cold. But that's part of the healing. Because clarity doesn't always feel like comfort, it often feels like loss first. But once the loss settles, you're left with something far more powerful than approval or attention. You're left with alignment. You're left with an unshakable understanding of who you are and what kind of energy you're no longer available for. And from that place, from that centered awareness, everything you attract shifts. You no longer seek validation, you exude certainty. You no longer chase closeness, you embody it. And in time, the connections that remain, or the ones that find you, will reflect that. They'll be rooted in something unshakable. Something that doesn't waver in silence. Something that doesn't need fixing. That's the power of walking away without anger. Of stepping back without noise. Of choosing solitude over performance. That's what Stoic relationships are all about, creating a space where truth can rise. And if someone is unwilling or unable to meet you in that truth, then your silence becomes your boundary. It says everything words couldn't. It says, I've loved you, I've shown up, I've given, and now I choose peace. And from there, you let the story unfold. You watch who circles back and who disappears. You observe, not react. You feel, but you don't chase. You listen, but you don't lose yourself. And in that grounded stillness, the right ones will show themselves. They won't be scared of the silence because they know it's not distance, it's depth. They won't take your absence as rejection, they'll see it as sacred space. And they'll meet you in it, not with panic, but with presence. That's how you'll know you're finally connected to something real. So if this part of the message hits you, like and comment. Number 1. Right now to let the world know you're done performing for love and ready to be chosen in silence. And if you're committed to walking this stoic path of peace, truth, and emotional strength, subscribe to the channel now. We're only getting started. What comes next will change everything. There's a quiet kind of strength that never demands attention but commands it anyway. It's not the kind that shouts over chaos or pleads for acknowledgement. It's the kind that settles deeply into the bones of anyone who's lived through emotional noise long enough to crave stillness. That strength is found in the choice to step back, not in weakness, but in wisdom. Not in bitterness, but in balance. You don't walk away from people because you stopped loving them. You walk away because you finally realize that love, when it's real, does not need to be chased, proven, or preserved through self-abandonment. You stop because you've carried enough. Because your peace matters more than their confusion. Because the connection, if it's real, will either grow in your absence or fade with your silence, and either outcome will be a gift. That's the paradox of emotional gravity. When you stop pulling, you begin to draw. When you stop filling every silence with explanations, with justifications, with one more attempt to be seen clearly, something extraordinary begins to happen. The people who only knew how to exist with you through your emotional effort begin to feel the echo of your absence, and they don't know what to do with it. Some may never admit it. but they will sit in the ripple effect. Others will wake up and come forward, not out of guilt, but from a place of grounded realization. That's when you know the difference between those who loved you and those who loved how you loved them. And that difference is everything. Because in that difference, you start to find yourself. You begin to reclaim your center. You start to see that your silence was never a lack of love, it was an act of love for yourself. You were not withdrawing to punish anyone. You were returning home to your own soul. That shift, that recentering, becomes the foundation of a new life. A quieter one. A more peaceful one. One built not on constant emotional noise, but on presence, still, strong, unwavering. And from that place, you begin to create new standards. You begin to love with boundaries. To care without carrying everything. To show up without losing yourself in the process. You begin to engage in stoic relationships, ones rooted in mutual awareness, emotional responsibility. And the kind of calm that doesn't crumble when things get quiet. Because now, you're no longer seeking the high of emotional intensity. You're seeking alignment. Resonance. Energy that doesn't need to be explained, only honored. You realize that anyone who truly values you won't be confused by your calm. They'll feel safe in it. They won't see your silence as rejection. They'll recognize it as a sacred container, a space where truth, not fear, can be heard. And if they can't hold that space, if they run from it, then your stillness has done its job. It has revealed what noise once concealed. That's the quiet gift of stepping back. It forces the energy to balance or break. And either one sets you free. It shows you who's emotionally mature enough to meet you in silence, and who needed your noise to avoid their own. So you let go. Not with final words or dramatic exits, but with a clarity so deep it no longer needs to be spoken. You don't beg for closure. You don't search for signs. You stop giving people the tools to dismantle your peace. You trust that your silence, your stillness, your grounded presence says everything that needed to be said. And from there you walk. Not away from them, but toward yourself. You walk toward the life that doesn't ask you to shrink to be loved. Toward relationships that feel like ease, not emotional labor. Toward a version of you that no longer performs, but simply exists in truth. This is what emotional freedom looks like. It's not loud. It's not reactive. It doesn't post proof. It doesn't chase clarity. It holds its own. It moves through the world quietly, disrupting everything built on illusion. And in time, everything that remains around you has been filtered by your peace. Not by what you said, but by what you didn't say. Not by how hard you tried, but by how still you stood. That is the final transformation. You no longer need closure from them, because you've closed the chapter internally. You no longer need validation, because you've seen your own worth in the absence of their approval. And if one day they look back and finally understand the depth of your silence, the truth of your presence, and the strength of your goodbye, that's not your story to finish. That's theirs to carry. You've already written your truth. And that truth is not an apology. It's not a plea. It's not a performance. It's a peace that echoes. Quiet. Lasting. Untouchable. And now you begin again, not with noise, but with clarity. Not with new promises, but with a new posture. Rooted. Resilient. Unbothered. Whole.